Okay, so first of all, I would like to thank Benedetta and all the organizers. I must confess I started my neuroethical work on consciousness in 2010, exactly in Liège, where I spent a few months for an exchange grant. So I'm really connected, also emotionally, I must say, to Stephen Group, and I have very good memory of that period. So I'm very happy for this opportunity to talk to you. And yeah, I just wanted to add as a premise that the work we are doing on consciousness is, we might say, divided into main lines of research. The first is more theoretical, and so we try to develop a theory of consciousness in dialogue with other main theories of consciousness. And the other main trend is more ethical, we might say applied, also within, of course, fundamental neuroethics, but we have also an open eye to applied issues. And the illustration I'm now presenting is on the edge, we might say, between theoretical and applied ethical analysis. So and the ethical relevance of the unconscious is and the title of a paper we published 3 years ago, more or less, and it was an attempt to question the usual way to ethically analyze disorders of consciousness, and how ethicists usually consider this kind of issues. We might summarize the usual approach as basically focus on residual consciousness. So if there is consciousness, if there is residual consciousness, then the subject is ethically relevant and significant. And so the ethical discourse is limited to check whether there is residual consciousness. But we problematize this assumption in the following way. First of all, we should start from a more theoretical premise, which is the traditional description of conscious and unconscious. Usually, the unconscious is conceived both by lay people, but also by some scientists, as deeply separated, if not opposed, to consciousness. So we have two separated realms, consciousness and the unconscious, and they are conceived as opposed and not in connection with each other. But we have an increasing number of new data showing that the unconscious is not so, we might say, not so much diverse than than consciousness, paradoxically. And so it's, for instance, it's not a passive repository of information. I forgot also to give you another premise. I'm not referring, of course, to the Freudian unconscious, but to the cognitive unconscious. So my analysis is not about, the psychoanalytical unconscious, but we are referring to what the brain does without us being aware of it. So the cognitive unconscious. So to illustrate, a lot of monitoring work, for instance, active exploration of the environment, takes place in the brain at the unaware level. And this kind of work shows important, significant similarities with awareness, and has also a deep connection with awareness. So this means that the brain does a lot of work at the unaware level, which is really similar to what we do at the aware level. So the opposition between aware and unaware levels is not scientifically so, well based. And in the end, is quite misleading. This is just one of many references we might consider that shows this, again, this growing data about the similarities between conscious and the unconscious. And they titled this book The New Unconscious, which is, to summarize, the new way to look at the unconscious. Brain is very similar to consciousness. And so, again, to illustrate, at the unconscious level, the brain is able to correlate information, for instance, to associate meanings, to reason in a very fast way. So the brain can reason also at the unaware level, to develop complex computations, for instance. The brain is, we might say, a kind of mathematical organ, to perform also sophisticated mathematical operations, and again to selectively focus on information, develop complex inferences, etc. This is just to give a very rough idea of what the brain is able to do at the unaware level. And also, the unconscious, the new unconscious, is not disconnected from consciousness. So the relationship between the unconscious and consciousness is not dialectic or nor dualistic, but we have a relationship of mutual conditioning. So we have a binary exchange, we can say, of information, of course, and of impact. So the unconscious impact consciousness and vice versa. So the unconscious, for instance, affects the ability of the specific modulation of conscious perception. So our conscious perception is, of course, affected by what is going on at the unaware level. And on the other hand, consciousness contributes to shape the unconscious, for instance, through an epigenetic imprinting of life experiences. The experiences that we live, including the experiences we consciously choose to live, affect our unconscious. So we have, actually, we have a way, of course, to affect also willingly our unconscious, which is to choose what to do or what to read, for instance, or what to I don't know, what to watch on television, etc. So the experiences that we do, of course, affect our unconscious. Now we go from the, we might say, scientific premise to the ethical analysis. I was referring in the title to the ethical relevance of the unconscious. What do I mean by ethical relevance? By ethical relevance, I do not mean ethical significance. So we have this important distinction in the ethical analysis between relevance and significance. Relevance means deserving moral consideration. So something is ethically relevant if it deserves to be analyzed, taken into account in the ethical analysis. So I do not attach any specific ethical value to what is ethically relevant, because what is ethically relevant needs to be ethically analyzed. So the final ethical value is something emerging, resulting from the ethical analysis of something which is ethically relevant. On the other hand, ethical significance or moral significance refers explicitly to a specific value. So to jump to the conclusion of my analysis, when I say that the unconscious is ethically relevant, I'm not saying that it has a specific ethical value. I'm just saying that we need to take into account also the unconscious when we do an ethical assessment, for instance, of disorders of consciousness. So I'm not taking any specific position regarding the specific value of the unconscious. I'm just saying that it needs to be ethically analyzed, as well as, of course, as well as consciousness. This is a crucial point, very important. So in order to disentangle any kind, of misunderstanding on this. So to argue for the ethical relevance of the unconscious, we develop a couple of arguments. The first we named strong argument, and it says that if consciousness is ethically relevant, which means it deserves to be taken into account in the ethical analysis because of what it can enable, specifically experiential well-being and having interest, and the unconscious may enable comparable things, then the unconscious is also ethically relevant. Usually in the neuroethical analysis of disorders of consciousness, the the reasoning is pretty simple. So residual consciousness should be taken into account in the ethical analysis because it enables the subject to experience well-being and to have interest. So these are the two conditions assumed as necessary and also sufficient in order to consider consciousness as ethically relevant. But there are increasing data showing that also the unconscious allow us to experience well-being and to have interest, because both these concepts might be framed in connection to consciousness, but also in connection to the new unconscious. So if we say that consciousness is ethically relevant because of this, then we should logically conclude that also the unconscious is ethically relevant because it allows the same things. So this is pretty logical reasoning. The other argument is that if consciousness is ethically relevant and the unconscious is, at least in part, the result of consciousness, then the unconscious is also ethically relevant because it derives, so to say, from consciousness. Or conversely, if consciousness is ethically relevant and the unconscious plays an important role in shaping consciousness, then the unconscious is also ethically relevant. In this case, we have a kind of derivative ethical relevance of the unconscious. This is the reason why the argument is named weak argument. But the point is always the same, which is if we think that consciousness is ethically relevant because of something that it allows us to do, but the unconscious allows us to do the same things, then we should consider also the unconscious ethically relevant. And I think this is pretty important in the context of disorders of consciousness. The other day we had a meeting with some collaborators, including Stephen, and Stephen stressed that often in the scientific, but we might say also in the ethical discourse about disorders of consciousness, family needs are not so much taken into account. Well, when you have a relative impaired, affected by disorders of consciousness, I don't think it's so, it's so sure that they really focus on how much conscious they are, but how much they, for instance, do they feel pain or do they suffer, how much responsive they are. This responsiveness or this suffering or experience of pain might be framed in terms of residual consciousness, but also in terms of residual, so to say, unconsciousness. So the point is to have an encompassing, a more complete, we might say, ethical analysis of these issues. So to go to conclusion, the unconscious deserves an ethical attention. So it should be taken into account in the ethical analysis. And with this, of course, again, I do not say that it has the same ethical value as consciousness, of course. So we need further arguments. We need, of course, another kind of reasoning to then attach, so to say, or attribute a specific ethical value to the unconscious. But it is, and this is out of question, a factor to take into account in the ethical analysis of different issues, including, of course, disorders of consciousness. But it's still an open question whether it is sufficient, to prove that the patient is experiencing something at the unaware level. Is this sufficient to conclude that it deserves to be, for instance, keep alive? This is something that we should consider at another level. So I am, in this sense, within the fundamental neuroethics, we might say, methodology. So I'm exploring the meaning and the logical implication of the concept we use. Okay, so this is what I just told you. Yeah, that's it. So thank you for your attention.